Welcome everyone. This monthly talk is by Dr. Viv Newman. It is titled Two Funeral Wreaths of Broken Song, Mothers' Poetry of Gallipoli.
And I'm actually, after that very kind introduction, I actually feel I should start off with a confession, because rather than being a military historian with a profound knowledge of Gallipoli, I am in fact an imposter. Although I have visited Gallipoli a number of times and stayed, as I know a number of you will have done, with Errol at Edgebat, at the Pension Les Panorama, and over the years I've walked probably hundreds of miles around the peninsula, I would not be able to tell you which battalion occupied which trench, and would probably only confidently be able to give you the names of a few of the big battles. So what I'm going to do now is focus on my own little corner of this foreign field, women's poetry of the Great War, and in particular, the grief poetry of two mothers, one of whom has left a detailed account of what in 21st century terminology would be referred to as her bereavement journey, and the other a simple, heartfelt tribute to her young son, Royal Inniskillen Fusilier, Private John Vincent Toye. In the late 1990s, I was teaching an anthology of women's war poetry at my local adult community college. One student commented that he had an abiding interest in the Gallipoli campaign. Driving home, I began to wonder how many women poets had actually written about Gallipoli, and if any of their writings had been preserved. These musings eventually took me to Birmingham Central Library, the then rather surprising depository of the largest individual collection of Great War poetry in the country. Leafing through a bibliography of poetry of the First World War, I discovered a rather tantalizing entry, which I'd like to read to you in its entirety. Mater Dolorosa by A.E.G., published William Heinemann, 1915, 56 pages. Dedicated to the author's son, Hugo Frederick Grantham, killed in the Gallipoli Peninsula, 28th of June, 1915. This rather cryptic reference started AEG and me on a long journey together. But first of all, who was this AEG? Would I be able to find out more about her and her soldier son, Hugo? Was I even right in assuming that the title Mater Dolorosa suggested a female poet? I had already come across writings by bereaved fathers who adopted a female voice. Mothers, seemingly, were more entitled to grieve than fathers. Hot on her trail, I discovered, stashed away in the British Library, 19 other poetry collections, plays, and books by this AEG. And yes, she was female. It soon became obvious that under cover of either patriotic texts or by writing about subjects seemingly unrelated to war, she was masking powerful diatribes against armed conflict, in which she highlighted the agony of individuals across all nations, forced to sacrifice their loved ones to war's lust. Her sonnets to Hugo, that on the surface appear to be little more than stylized elegies, are a vivid recreation of protest, grief, mourning, and ultimately even sedition. They tell the story of a mother's complicated grief, a grief which, as I would soon discover, included a further hidden twist. So, I think I should now introduce you to this AEG, in fact, Alexandra Ethelreda Sylvie von Herder, born in 1868. She studied at Girton College, Cambridge, and had Cambridge actually conferred degrees on women in the 1890s, she would have graduated with first-class honours. At Cambridge, though with the chaperoning of women students that took place at this time, it is almost surprising that this happened at all, she met and in April 1894 married fellow Cambridge student, Trinity man, Frederick William Grantham. By training a lawyer, by profession a soldier, by inclination a collector and aficionado of Chinese art, Frederick's position as the son of an influential judge and a member of the British establishment seemingly sat uncomfortably with his own and his wife's love of Eastern mysticism. Neither side appears to have been enthusiastic about the marriage. Alexandra was a German citizen, although the laws of the time meant that she had to relinquish her nationality on marriage. She further antagonized her parents-in-law by employing a German lady's maid, because even before the outbreak of war, she loathed nationalism, calling it bubbles of poison gas fermenting on a swamp of ignorance and fear. She could not have guessed how this poison gas would blight her life. With tensions in Anglo-German relations becoming ever more severe before the war broke out, Alexandra not severing links with her homeland and continuing her profession as a translator from German to English, the relationship between the younger and the older Granthams was tense. So much so that when Captain Frederick Grantham went overseas during the Boer War with the Royal Munster Fusiliers, Alexandra, and by her 2 young sons, did not reside with Frederick's family, but instead were in lodgings, albeit rather superior ones, in Hanover Square, where I'm sure her redoubtable mother tried to keep a weather eye on Frederick's unusual family. With Alexandra a firm believer in women's rights and mother-in-law wishing to have no dealings with such nonsense, Alexandra may have taken mischievous pleasure in providing for her own family and living, according to the 1901 census, through independent needs, and thus not beholden to her husband or his relations. There are veiled hints in Alexandra's writing that the couple found it hard to reignite their relationship when he returned from South Africa. The problems that men will face readjusting to civilian life after being at war are often overlooked in the excitement of their homecoming, a problem that is still with us today when troops return from combat operations. Nevertheless, Alexandra and Frederick successfully ironed out their differences, and in 1912 they took out a long lease on Beeleigh Abbey near Malden in Essex, seeing this as their long-term home. Perhaps it was a safe distance away from mother-in-law. The senior Grantham's country residence was in Barcombe in Sussex. There may well also have been antagonism over child rearing, as, somewhat unusually for her day and social class, Alexandra was a hands-on mother. The bond she formed with her sons is perhaps more typical of the one forged between less affluent mothers and their children, one which is evident in the writing of my other Gallipoli bereaved amateur poet, a working-class woman, Sarah Toye, although Sarah may have welcomed an occasional break from her ever-increasing family. But in Alexandra's class and background, mothers were distant figures, but her maternal love appears in her Gallipoli poetry. She recreates tender memories of oft-times singing lullabies to soothe the infant into sleep, spending long vigils by his cradle, peeping to see if he really were slumbering. As so many grieving mothers would do, she holds on to visions of her dead child in order to keep him with her a little longer. Better to remember a child in its cradle than imagine it rotting in the earth of some foreign field, its body disintegrating in what she would ultimately describe as the hideous darkness of an airless, narrow grave. Evidence of memories and artifacts being used to hold reality at bay runs through many bereaved mothers' poetry and grief writings. But the tragedy of Gallipoli lay far in the future when the lease on Beeleigh Abbey was taken out, because despite their parents' view on the rearing of children, 13-year-old Hugo and subsequently his brother Alexander had been dispatched to public schools. Meanwhile, over in Derry, young Vinny, as he was called, had finished his elementary school education and was being apprenticed to a cabinet maker. But while Vinny was working through his apprenticeship, Hugo was progressing through the military side of Cheltenham College, being turned into a typical product of his gender, age and class through the British education system emphasis on the manly qualities of sport and warfare, or what was considered to be masculine Christianity. Indeed, wise after the event, It is easy to cringe at the part the now 18-year-old Hugo played in a February 1914 school debate. Defending the motion, in the opinion of this House, war is a necessary evil, his pragmatic contribution was, war is useful in the killing off of the superfluous portions of the human race. The army provides work for the unemployed, and without war, this college could not exist because there would be no military side. The motion was easily carried. All too soon, many of those young, youthful debaters who locked horns for the final time on their college's playing fields in June 1914 would be dead, not to mention some of their fathers. Fate would soon catch up with Vinnie, who seems to have abandoned his apprenticeship and his teeming home where 8 toys lived in a 2-up, 2-down in central Derry. He joined the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, perhaps with no war on the horizon. His now widowed mother, Sarah, saw Vinnie's departure as one less mouth to feed. Only Vinnie's eldest brother, John, was in full-time work in 1911. Having been stationed in India at Trimulgeri, if that's the right way to pronounce it, until the regiment was recalled at the end of 1914, Vinnie arrived in England in early January 1915. Whether Sarah got what would be a final glimpse of her son before he embarked for Egypt on the 12th of March is unclear. If Sarah had only one family member to worry about, this time around, Alexandra would experience war as both a wife and a mother. By September 22nd, Captain Frederick Grantham was serving with the Royal Munster Fusiliers in France. In that earlier South Africa war, she had had very young children to care for, and history would in part repeat itself, because in 1911, Godfrey Harry had been born. Alexandra's maternal duties extended from caring for a 3-year-old to having a son considered old enough in the eyes of the War Office to serve overseas. Now aged 19, Hugo had been gazetted second lieutenant with the Essex Regiment. There was also 15-year-old Alexander, who would be safe, just as long as it was all over, if not by this Christmas, then at least the one after that. If the Granthams were at least outwardly a stereotypical, socially privileged British family, which had offered 2 officers to their nation's cause, Alexandra now had to contend with being what was considered an enemy. Many German-born citizens discovered that having a husband or a son in His Majesty's army was not deemed proof positive of loyalty to the British cause. Alexandra loathed the nationalistic feelings sweeping the land. Those who vented themselves on wrecking alien shops added, she said, nothing either to the dignity or to the strength of the country on whose behalf it was set on foot. In Mater Dolorosa, she at times distances herself from her adopted country. This is her son's native land. Her empathy lies with mothers across all combatant nations. Reading between the lines of her poetry, one senses that Alexandra was aware of the views her son had expressed in his school's 1914 debate, although she knows where to lay the blame. In her poetry to Hugo, she bitterly condemns those misguided rulers who succeed in luring young men to death with cries of fame, danger, duty, sacrifice. She is painfully aware that her family had bought in to the ubiquitous patriarchal discourse. Too late, she realizes what this means, not only for her and hers, not even for the mothers and sons of her adopted country, but for all mothers across the combatant nations who bore sons and in their beauty gave them back. Alexandra is bitterly aware that the price for women of these seemingly masculine virtues, so praised by rulers and the state, is unbearable grief. A man may arguably gain some form of glory, but for mothers, this self-same glory is simply a form of torture of each mother's heart in every nation. She understands what it means for women when lawless lust of conquest parades as righteousness and godless things are done in God's name. Time and again, she will revisit the cost of war in terms of a mother's mental agony. She places this agony in different cultures and in different eras, writing as easily about China under the Tang dynasty as about Akhenaten and ancient Egypt, as about 18th century Germany, as about the 1914 to 1918 war, knowing that if the technologies of war might change, the price demanded of mothers in tears and suffering remains identical. She acknowledges that human rhythms have gone wrong. Drum taps call blood-intoxicated mobs to brutal battles. Mothers become powerless, unable to shield their sons from death. The greatest wrong done to women, she argues, throughout history has been the depriving a mother of ownership in what so essentially belongs to her, the children to whom she has given birth. This maternal deprivation, which began for more affluent British mothers with their sons being sent away to school, so often culminated in the 20th century with their death in battle. One of the most poignant scenes in her elegy to Hugo, indeed it is one of the most poignant scenes in all of the hundreds of war poems that I have read, occurs at the very moment when that deprivation becomes physical reality. Alexandra joins other women at Malden Station in Essex as, waving with trembling hands, they bid their sons and loved ones farewell. Women etch valiant smiles on their faces to mask the aching hearts they dare not show. Alexandra demonstrates an intense awareness of women's need to be publicly cheerful, not only for their own, but also for their menfolk's sake. Men may be represented as marching to war to protect women, but in that agonizing moment of farewell, the woman must protect the man, lest he should sorrow too, seeing thine own mother cry. She understands that if a woman lets her guard down, the man may be unable to cope. Hence her brave farewell, as she watches Hugo and his companions entrain for the killing fields of the Dardanelles. I often wonder how many of the women, whom history has so roundly condemned for cheering the boys as they left for France, were hiding breaking hearts with hollow smiles. Alexandra advises womankind, when their sons towards our fights are starting, by the loud train be mirth, not moan of fears. Fears must wait for the privacy of the lonely bed. One senses that under cover of darkness, Alexandra, like so many mothers, wives, and sweethearts, wept that, and many more nights away. That little scene at Malden Station is one that would have been enacted the length and breadth of all combatant nations for 4 long years. It epitomizes the gendering of warfare. Men pile excitedly into the train waiting for the whistle to blow, leaving the women behind to wave with trembling hands till the train is lost from sight. Men rush to follow their country's colours. Women stare as the station master unfurls his green flag. Yet the language of warfare seeps into the part women play in this oft-repeated and oft-poeticized drama. As the men leave for the front, women must win their own victory o'er mothers' tears. Stations, the sites of so many final, heartbreaking farewells, highlight the difference in men and women's war experiences. As the younger men are taken off to war, women and children remain rooted to the spot, gazing dumbly after the departing locomotive, wandering home to empty houses with discarded sport equipment and silent gramophones, agonizing reminders of the one who has just left, maybe forever. Even children who lived into their 90s still vividly remembered bidding that final heart-stopping farewell to their soldier father. Alexandra's memories turn bittersweet. She realises Hugo's cricket bat, so recently used triumphantly when he gained his century not out in a match played in that carefree early summer of 1914, will always lean idle there against the wall. And rather than the shouts of happy youths and her 3 young sons playing sport on the Abbey lawns, now a dreadful silence fills this house. For some poets, sport heightens the contrast between peaceful pre-war England and war's lurid hecatomb on ravaged soil. For others, sport emphasises how England's young officers, who are now playing in the grand international final, uphold traditions learnt on the playing fields of their schools, playing cricket, as we know, on Shell Green, or dribbling footballs across no man's land, to the praise of the British and disdain of the German press. But to return to Hugo, he sailed from Avonmouth and arrived in Alexandra on the 2nd of April, where he wrote an upbeat letter full of schoolboy pranks and slang, as well as mentioning he had made his will whilst on board, surely enough to chill the heart of any mother of a 20-year-old. 3 weeks later, he was again afloat. He landed at W Beach on the 25th of April, 1915. On the same day, the Royal Inniskillings Fusiliers, including Private John Vincent Toye, came ashore at X Beach at 9 a.m. Their task to consolidate the beachhead at the top of the cliffs. Subsequent accounts reported the battalion landed at 0900 hours without difficulty and advanced some 600 yards inland. They were ordered to dig in, and later that night they repulsed an attack. There they awaited a general advance in concert with troops from the other landing beaches. But, as we all know, that delay proved disastrous. By the time the general advance was organised 3 days later, only limited progress was made, and every yard gained after was to be a hard and bloody slog. By evening, Vincent and the Inniskillings were dug in 600 yards inland. Of course, neither Sarah nor Alexandra were aware of the unfolding disaster, and Alexandra's thoughts would also have been turning to France, where Frederick Grantham would be caught up in the fighting at Richebourg on the Western Front. Maternal agonies were temporarily replaced by wifely ones, for on May the 9th, 1915, news reached Beeleigh Abbey that Captain Frederick Grantham had been reported as wounded in battle and believed to have been taken prisoner. But perhaps that did not seem too terrible a fate to a German-born woman who must have surely dismissed the lurid rumours about the Germans' treatment of prisoners. With extensive contacts in Switzerland, she might even have been able to pull some strings and arrange Frederick's release. Having heard about his father, Hugo wrote home on the 21st of June, reassuring his mother that, in the fog of engagement, no one quite knows what is happening or where anyone is. The summer days lengthened, and both Sarah and Alexandra had other children to care for. 7-year-old Catherine in Derry and 3-year-old Godfrey at Beeleigh Abbey. No doubt, both of these youngsters were oblivious to their mother's anxieties and, for Godfrey, the destiny of his father. In Derry, a 16-year-old Robert, and in Essex, a 15-year-old Alexander, were sulking because they were too young to go to war. If a dreadful silence filled Beeleigh, as Alexandra recounts, it is unlikely that the tiny house in Derry was ever silent. Alexandra, meanwhile, confesses that she cannot bear to see Hugo's chair, his gramophone, and the records he loved to play all are locked away. His cricket bat stands idle against the wall. For some women, the lost child's possessions provide comfort. For many, the memories they bring back are far too painful. Meanwhile, considerable attempts were being made to ascertain the whereabouts of Captain Frederick Grantham. Was he really simply missing and wounded? Would there be sweetness when Alexandra once again saw her wounded man long mourned as dead? Would the wife's endless longing for her husband each night on lonely bed culminate in the joy of physical reunion. In the intimacy of her poetry, she hints at her intense sexual need for her husband, a need which, despite the conventions and taboos of the eras, many women, older as well as younger, poignantly explore in their poetry. But nevertheless, it is Hugo, in the thick of the Gallipoli maelstrom, who soon takes centre stage in Alexandra's thoughts. Maternal fears and pride intermingle in her poetry, as first one of these sentiments, then the other overtakes her. She greets with elation during the third battle for Krithia. Hugo's name was sent forward to be mentioned in dispatches for exceptional gallantry and coolness in heading a bombing party against the Turks and successfully ejecting them for an advanced position on the 4th of June 1915. Momentarily, she relishes the promise of military fame that at other times she criticises. Just for a minute, war becomes a time of glorious endeavour. Personal pride at her child's manly achievements overtakes philosophical condemnation, temporarily at least. Against all the odds, Hugo was one of the 4 remaining officers of the 25 who had landed on W Beach a few weeks earlier. Similarly, Vinnie, who saw actions on the 28th of April, the 6th of May and the 4th of June, was still, almost miraculously, alive. In a letter home, Hugo appears both embarrassed and proud of his achievements, just as he is both boy and man in this letter, where he recounts schoolboy-like pranks and then chilling details about shells and ammunition. In Alexandra's thoughts and writings, he oscillates between being my boy, born in entrancing peace, and my hero son, blood of my blood, flesh of my flesh, their very consanguinity giving her an entree into his masculine world of brave deeds and manly actions in that distant peninsula straddling Europe and Asia. At the end of June 1915, as we all know, the fighting in Gallipoli intensified once again. With Krithia, the first day's objective still a kilometre away, the great military minds decided it was time for another of those ill-fated last pushes. The Battle of Gully Ravine began at 10:45 a.m. on Monday, the 28th of June. According to its regimental diary entry, by noon, A, B, C companies of the Inniskillings, including Private John Vincent Toye, were converting parapet and removing dead and wounded from the trenches. Meanwhile, having been held in reserve for most of the 28th of June, in the late afternoon, supported by 2 few guns, Lieutenant Hugo Grantham and men of the 1st Battalion, the Essex Regiment, were taking part in a diversionary attack near Gully Ravine. This proved fruitless. The men were torn to shreds. The following week, a telegram arrived at Beeleigh. Alexandra learnt that never again on this wide earth would her mother arms enfold her child, nor strain thee to my heart. For Hugo, there will be no homecoming. In death, the young lieutenant reverts to being the beloved little child, the son firstborn, whom she brought forth on a blessed Easter day 20 short years ago. On the 1st of July, Private Toye 10028 and his comrades were improving trenches and digging sap from J12 to J11. Then the enemy made a bomb attack. The Inniskillings' left flank was exposed, and inevitably casualties were sustained. What would be John Vincent Toye's fate? On July the 26th, a local Essex newspaper, the Malden Advertiser, carried a fairly typical officer obituary, telling of Hugo's bravery, of his scholastic and of his sporting achievements, including those in cricket matches against neighbouring teams. Somehow, this last homely detail turns the idolised son into a real flesh and blood young man who was very much part of his local community, no doubt commanding men who had played on both sides of that cricket divide. The newspaper editor hoped that Mrs. Grantham, would soon receive positive news of her husband's whereabout, and included an elegy for Hugo, written and subsequently set to music by his mother. These simple lines give us an insight into the agony of wartime mothers who were tormented by the unfulfillable longing now recognised as therapeutic for the bereaved, to cradle for a final time their beloved child's body. Initially, like so many mothers, she takes some comfort from believing Hugo was first amongst the brave. It would be some time before she saw death in war only as a pointless sacrifice, leaving anguished mothers to sob out, "Why with our son's blood must the vulture war be fed?" At much the same time as Alexandra was penning her first grief poem to Hugo, news reached 2 Glasgow Street, Derry. Sarah Toye learnt that her young son was indeed one of the 5 rank and file who had been killed. She may not have endorsed Major General Delisle's sentiments conveyed to the regiment by telegram, "Well done, Inniskillings." Sarah now took up her pen and laments her inability to comfort her child as he died. Had he only been brought home, however severely wounded, loved ones could have stood around his bedside as he died. Whilst the language may be less sophisticated than Alexandra's, the prayer is equally heartfelt. God rest his soul in peace. If Alexandra could find a respected publisher for her elegies, Sarah placed the paper in a drawer, almost certainly never imagining it would find a wider audience.
A reading of In Memory of Private John Vincent Toye. Had he reached home, though sorely maimed, our own precious dear, and friends stood round his bedside as the end was drawing near. Some comfort then we could have got, we knew where he was laid, bedewed the grave top with our tears and keep it bright arranged. Each evening as the sun went down, we could have wandered there, and bending low before our God, have said a silent prayer. Until we meet on heaven's bright shore, we bid adieu for evermore. Till all our earthly sorrows cease, God rest his soul in peace.
Sarah's poeticized and preserved testimony is a valuable and relatively unusual source, being from someone who had left elementary school aged about 11. Not for her the Cambridge education that Alexandra had so relished. As was becoming increasingly apparent, grief for a lost loved one was heartfelt across all social classes, and the lack of a grave to tend and beside which to mourn was a deep-rooted pain shared by many of the bereaved. This led post-war to petitions begging the Prince of Wales to intervene with the government for bodies to be repatriated. These petitions garnered thousands of names. An increasingly bitter controversy over who owned the bodies of the dead swirled, but the government and the Imperial War Commission stood their ground. Even had they not, Vinnie would never have been repatriated, and his family would never know where he was laid. His name is among the 20,878 on the towering Heli's memorial to the missing. While Sarah may have believed that bringing even a sorely maimed son home would have eased both his and his family's sufferings, She was naturally unaware of the conditions and the cargoes of suffering men leaving the Dardanelles on hospital ships such as Delta, where Royal Navy nurse Anna Cameron was serving. Whilst there is significant testimony from Anzac nurses on Lemnos, there is less from nurses on hospital ships transporting the wounded from Gallipoli. In a letter written on the 8th of May 1915, Anna had told her family, "We had taken in 400 horribly wounded men straight from the field. Some were shot further in the boats which took them to us. The gangway ran with blood. Some of the poor fellows hadn't had one dressing on. One needed all one's common sense and courage. We 3 sisters had 200 of the wounded and only 6 orderlies at that time. So many were needed for stretcher bearers. They came pouring in. The orderlies were good, but untrained for emergencies. The wounded were so dead beat that we wrapped them in their filthy clothes, poor fellows, and let them rest. Faces shot away, arms, legs, lungs, shots everywhere. One said, 'Thank God we have the sisters.'" Having sailed to England with her cargo of horrifically wounded men, by the 26th of August, Delta, with Anna still on board, had returned to the Dardanelles, where we saw the long line of stretcher bearers dashing along the shore to the shore, and the boats put off thick and fast. Our turn soon came. With 1,240 men on board a ship staffed for 536, the 6 medical officers, 12 nurses, and 45 other staff were totally overwhelmed. Delta started once more for home. In her diary, Anna confesses the hopelessness of struggling against heavy odds, and unable to relieve suffering adequately, tries me so dreadfully. The other sisters keep calmer inside. I can't. If only I could. 3 months later, her need to abandon the dying, to attempt to minister to the still just living, is almost torturing her. The memory of some things which have often had to be left undone in the stress of war nursing stabs and stabs in the quiet days. A footnote to Anna's service that she was eventually invalided out of the war, suffering from what is now recognisably shell shock, one of several hundred nurses across all theatres to suffer this fate. But to return to our poets, for both these women, and indeed for hundreds of others, poetry writing was cathartic. But Alexandra's grief was further complicated by her still having no idea of her husband's whereabouts. Where was he? How dare he desert her? He should be at home with her as they grieve for their firstborn child. She yearns for Frederick's presence, in vain. Her tone becomes accusatory, returning to her German roots and addressing him in the formal you, sie, as opposed to the familiar thou, du. She uses when speaking to Hugo, she states, "You never come." Incidentally, this use of you and thou were the clues that led me to unravel the fact that she addresses both Frederick and Hugo in Mater Dolorosa, although no specific mention of this is made anywhere in the text. When I worked this out, it was almost a eureka moment. I felt she had truly let me into her mind. Frederick has failed her at the very moment she most needs his emotional and physical support. Now, anger, a recognized grief reaction, comes to the fore. She commands him, "See, facing you, the sorrow of a mother for her son. Why is he not there when she needs him to kiss my tears away?" If over in Derry, Sarah had nothing or no one other than Vinnie's siblings to comfort her for the bleak news that her second-born had been killed in action, and it would be 12 years until the Derry War Memorial was unveiled, Alexandra, at least, was able to arrange a memorial service for Lieutenant Hugo Frederick Grantham, held at All Saints Church, Malden, on August the 14th, 1915. By one of those ironic twists of fate, on that very same day, the Royal Munster Fusiliers were bringing in some of their dead who had lain in no man's land since the fierce fighting of May the 9th. A dog tag bearing the name Captain Frederick William Grantham was found. His body had simply disappeared. In September, a memorial service was held for Frederick, this time in Barcombe, Sussex, no doubt organised by his mother. The antagonisms that appear to have affected the Granthams had seemingly strengthened rather than diminished with the loss of both Frederick and Hugo. In Barcombe's Roll of Honour, Frederick is remembered as the brother of Major William and Mrs. Sybil Grantham, and the son of the late William Grantham QC and his wife Emma. No mention is made of Frederick's wife Alexandra, mother of his also remembered son Hugo. Battles for ownership of the dead were far from uncommon, with more than one well-documented case in France of body snatching, when the body of a son was removed under cover of nightfall by parents outraged that his young widow had successfully petitioned for him to be buried in her village as opposed to his native one. Irrespective of family feuds and antagonisms, life, or at least half-life, continues, even in wartime. Both Sarah and Alexandra had other children to care for. Alexandra hugged her grief to herself and sought comfort, to accept, and no doubt to offer platitudes to those around her who were similarly bereaved, although she confesses to Hugo that she is so very sick of seeming brave, a sentiment that countless bereaved women reiterate. In 1917, the drums of war beat again around Beeleigh Abbey, demanding the offering of a second Grantham son, to what Alexandra now termed the war god's lust. 18-year-old Alexander William Herder, so named for his German and English grandfathers and his German mother, was gazetted second lieutenant with the 18th Hussars. He reached France in time for the bitter fighting of the closing months of the First World War. He was spared, and eventually, in 1946, his Foreign Office career culminated in the governorship of Hong Kong, his parents' interest in and love of China being revisited in their son, whose governorship of the colony is considered one of the finest, as well as one of the longest. Alexandra, meanwhile, was still working out where she positioned herself. Were her men and the 900,000 from the British Empire the glorious dead? Or is chivalric terminology hollow, meaningless? Is death in battle totally pointless? If at times Mater Dolorosa oscillated between two opposing sets of values, soon there would be a clear winner. With the war drawing to its close, the philosophy which Alexandra had groped towards in 1915 crystallized. But she still needed a way to conceal these from the censors. In early 1918, she published Pencil Speakings from Peking. Positively reviewed in the Times Lifts Up of May the 30th, 1918, the reviewer notes that although Peking is the text of his sermon, this is a diatribe against war and nationalism, couched in an exploration of Chinese philosophy. It is a powerful indictment of Western nationalism with its bubbles of poison gas fermenting on a swamp of ignorance and fear. That Peking's reviewer assumed the author to be male may indicate belief that this type of work was more suited to a man, it was more masculine. The verse play, The Wisdom of Akhnoton, followed in 1920. This presents a pacifist pharaoh refusing to yield either to the entreaties of his counsellors or to the clamour of his soldiers bent on forcing him to uphold military prestige. The eponymous Akhnoton's wisdom stems from his passionate, reasoned protest against the spirit of aggressive nationalism. Grantham now distances herself totally from concepts of war, nationalism, and hegemony, and also from the big words which, by encouraging humans to howl for blood, hide the reality of war death. The struggle hinted at in Mater Dolorosa, where some temporary consolation could be found in portraying war as a time of marvellous endeavour, has been resolved. There is no glory in thy young blood spilt. Modernism has won. In the chivalric terminology of at least some of the pieces in Maître Dolorosa, soldiers might laughing leap into that death none but a hero dies. But in reality, their gorges rise at the stench of severed flesh. They slip down dazed in their own vomit. The conflict is resolved. Henceforth, AEG will write as a pacifist. If Alexandra was a published author whose writings attracted the attention of reviewers in the Times lit up, you may be wondering how Sarah's handwritten poems survived for 106 years. Well, in October 1926, the City of Derry War Memorial Committee compiled records of the city's war dead. Sarah appended the handwritten copy of the poem to the form that the bereaved were sent to ensure that their loved one's name was accurately recorded on the memorial. She requested that this be kept in the Book of Record, where it remains to this day. While Sarah would undoubtedly have visited the City of Derry Memorial, unveiled on the 23rd of June 1927, this was almost certainly her only contact with his preserved memory. With other bereaved relatives, including from the Gallipoli campaign, Sarah would have had, at least according to the local newspaper, a position of honour on the butcher side of the gardens, although, from the throngs attending, it is doubtful how much she actually saw. I'm sure many of you know about the pilgrimages to the war cemeteries organised by the St Barnabas Society, including the ones to Gallipoli in 1926 and 1936. Sadly, when I looked at the account of the pilgrimage at the British Library, I did not know about Sarah and did not check to see if her name was listed amongst the 200 pilgrims. But I somehow sense not, as her descendants with whom I have been in touch do not think that she ever travelled as far as England, let alone Turkey. And so, like so many of this bereaved of this campaign, she would have the opportunity to wander to his grave and bending low before our God have said a silent prayer, or even therapeutically touched his name where it is carved on the Heli's memorial. However, her descendants do feel that she would have been immensely proud that her little poem featured in my anthology of women's war poetry, 2 Months and Tears, which I had the great honour of launching at the Belgian Embassy on June the 28th, 2016. 6 Toye descendants actually travelled from Derry to attend. But still, the bloody 20th century, which in her own words began simultaneously in South Africa and with the Boxer Rebellion and the Opium Wars in China, and which, in less than 2 decades, had already piled up death and ruin, would deal the ageing Alexandra a final blow. You might remember 3-year-old Godfrey, who was playing on the Beeleigh Abbey lawns in 1915. 27 years minus 1 week after the death of his eldest brother, on June the 21st, 1942, Death's shadow reached out once again for a Grantham, this time for pilot officer and flying instructor Godfrey Harry. He met his death in an RAF flying accident in the skies above Repton. On the 27th anniversary of Hugo's death, perhaps remembering how, when writing about bereavement and long before his own or their son's premature death, Frederick had advised, on the anniversary of a loss, may the memory be revered by some token of respect and affection. Alexandra dropped 2 fragrant roses into the darkness of Godfrey's grave, one for her newly dead youngest, one for her long-dead eldest son. Their memories united in Roses, a delicate poem dated the 28th of June, 1942. Now, in her late 70s, Alexandra again took up her pen to commemorate poetically her last beloved, perfect son. What terrible times we live and perish in, she wrote in her maternal grief and despair. Can nothing be done to stop this Holocaust of the best of the young generation? The answer to her question proved as elusive in 1942 as it had in 1915. and as we are now ever more horrifyingly aware through the images of Ukraine, as it is to this day. Alexandra Grantham's war story is one of extreme, very feminine grief. It spans 3 wars, 2 hemispheres, and nearly half a century. Although she never went to war, she never made the munitions of war, she never even heard at first hand the monstrous anger of the guns. Yet still her life was as closely marked by war as a human being's can be. Yet she and Sarah Toye were but 2 among millions. They have become a multitude, the mothers who with old and trembling hands grope in the darkness, waiting for sons who will never return. Thank you.